Hotep, lovers of knowledge and children of the sun. Today's topic will be centered on how Christianity came to Africa. You see, many want to know how Christianity came to Africa. We must understand that this teaching today is centered on West Africa. That is how Christianity came to West Africa. You know, Christianity came into Africa through different parts of Africa, like East Africa, West Africa, North Africa. But before looking into this, as lovers of African history and seekers of knowledge, I implore you today to subscribe to my YouTube channel at Ebenezer Heru to know more of that history that you were not told in school, in order for you to pass it to your children and generation yet unborn. You see, as lovers of history, addicts of history, you must know that the idea of Christianity was first known in ancient Egyptian mythology and spirituality before the Europeans brought it to Africa. On the Egyptian walls in Egypt, ancient sites in Egypt, the Egyptians had a record of Isis, the wife of Osiris. The Egyptians recorded that Isis had the first virgin birth. That is, she had the first immaculate conception. Isis was impregnated by the spirit of her husband Osiris. She bore the first Messiah, and Messiah simply means Christ. She bore the first Christ, who was the first to have 12 disciples before Jesus, who was the first to walk on water before Jesus, who was the first to heal the sick and raise the dead before Jesus. He was also the first to die and resurrect. His name is Heru, but the Europeans called him Horus. This is 4100 BCE, before the story of Jesus 2000 BCE. Now, let us meticulously look at how Christianity entered Africa. In fact, we must be sincere here, and this is an historical fact. Christianity came to Africa first in Ethiopia. The Ethiopians were called pagans by the European Christians. The Ethiopians captured a Greek saint whose ship wrecked in Ethiopia. This is a saint captured by the Ethiopians. The Ethiopians are good people and kind people. They treated this Christian Greek saint with love, care, and kindness. They gave him food and they gave him shelter. They did not maltreat him. This priest is named Frumentus. He was the one who introduced Christianity to the Ethiopians when he converted an Ethiopian king named King Ezena to Christianity. King Ezena was one of the greatest kings in Ethiopia, and this was how Christianity came to East Africa, because Ethiopia is in East Africa. But I must tell you today, lovers of knowledge, the 21st century generation of black Africans see Christianity as the true religion that will lead them to salvation. They have discarded and they have demonized their own African ancestors because of Christianity. They believe that Christianity came into Africa, that is, Christianity came into existence or penetrated into Africa through peaceful evangelism. But this is a false statement. Christianity came into Africa through peaceful means only in Ethiopia, but was violent in West Africa. This work will expose the evils of this religion and its barbaric acts in Africa, starting from the mid-15th century. Therefore, open your mind as lovers of knowledge and listen with understanding. And if you have any doubt about what I'm saying today, make the research yourself. Importantly, it is knowledgeable to know that Christianity came to Africa through the ship of slave trade during the transatlantic slave trade. But before looking into this transatlantic slave trade, that is the European slave trade, it will be very imperative to briefly look into the Muslim-Arab slave trade, which was the first slave trade that brought in Islam to Africa. The Muslim-Arab slave trade have already started in Africa over 700 years ago, before the European transatlantic slave trade. This slave trade started when the Arabs first invaded North Africa in the 7th century AD. The Arab first entry point into Africa was through Egypt, which name was Kemet, before it was changed to Egypt. Now, an Arab military general named General Amin Abin Alas invaded Egypt on December 639 AD with only 4,000 soldiers. General Amin successfully conquered Egypt and went ahead and conquered other places such as Tunisia and Western Libya. After those areas were fully conquered by the Arabs, they imposed tributes of 360 slaves in all regions they occupied and controlled. This act continued to develop and expanded to much larger demand. To keep up with this demand, Africans were taken as slaves to further south and places like Mali, Senegal, Chad, and even northern Nigeria. African slaves were used as sexual slaves and domestic house help to Arab traders. Sometimes, whenever any African slave is sick, its owner will quickly put a bullet in their head. It has been estimated that from the 10th to the 19th century, 6,000 to 7,000 slaves were transported each year, and each time African slaves under Arab slave traders crossed the desert, hundreds of black Africans died even before they get to a place of drinking water. The Arab slave trade was absolutely very devastating and brutal to the African people, to our African ancestors. Through this Islamic slave trade in Africa, Africans in North Africa were Islamized by their Arab slave masters. And today many Africans parade themselves as Muslims without knowing how the owners of such religion, how the owner of such brutal religion enslaved their black African ancestors for over 700 years. And this is the Arab slave trade. They don't want to teach us in schools. They don't want to talk about it. Many of us don't know about the Arab slave trade. All we know is the European transatlantic slave trade, because that is what the media is projecting to us. The Arab slave trade was so brutal. Africans were killed. Africans were slaughtered because of the Arab Muslims. We must speak this truth to our people. We must know these things. We must understand these things. The history lecturer in our university has failed. Our lecturers, they have failed to teach the true history of Africa. It is very deplorable. Now, as of the transatlantic slave trade, which transported Christianity into Africa, historically speaking, I repeat, historically speaking, it is said that Prince Henry the Navigator of Portugal came up with the idea of the European transatlantic slave trade. He was the one who made Portugal the first European country to engage in the slave trade from the mid-15th century, precisely in the 1450s. Africans were taken against their will and forced onto slave ships. The African slaves were then transported across the Atlantic Ocean. Slavery was supported and made legal by the European governments in the mid-15th century, by the popes and the monarchy of Europe. Captain John Hawkins was the first Englishman who made the first slave trade voyage to Africa from 1562. From 1562, he was the first man who made the slave trade voyage, the first slave trade voyage. And I want you to pay absolute attention to this. And this was during the reign of Queen Elizabeth I. She was the one who gave Captain John Hawkins the slave ship named Jesus of Lubeck. And the name Jesus is nothing else but an abbreviation. An abbreviation for Joint European Slave Union Ship. Your history lecturer will not teach you this. They will call it conspiracy theory. Because the government wants you to read their textbooks. Because the government wants to keep you mentally deluded and mentally brainwashed. John Hawkins was given a ship named Jesus of Lubeck by Queen Elizabeth the First. He was called the first transatlantic slave trader because he was the man who formed a triangular route across the ocean. In order to understand what the triangular or transatlantic slave trade what it means, one needs to understand that it was 3 continents that were involved, which were Europe, Africa, and America. Which was Europe, Africa, and America. You must know your history. That's why they call it the triangular slave trade. The slaves will leave Europe. Sorry, the slave ship will leave Europe to Africa. And when it landed in Africa, it will take Africans as slaves and move to America. And the slaves, the African slaves, will be exchanged with cotton, sugar, and other agricultural products. This is the history they will not teach you about how Christianity came to Africa. This is the untold history they will not teach you about how Christianity came to Africa. Millions of Africans were forced against their will and were told to work brutally in American and European plantations. For instance, in 1555, under the name of Christianity, John Hawkins, who is also an English Christian missionary, arrived in Africa, precisely Sierra Leone. Now, when he arrived, he had to deceive the innocent African people to join him to America. He had to deceive them to join him to America. Now, in the process of relating with these Africans, he started preaching about Jesus the Christ and Christianity. And he was able to sweet talk the Africans. The villagers, that is the Africans, were carried away by his gospel. Seeing how they have fallen completely, he asked how many of them will follow him and accept Jesus and be saved. Did you know that the first Africans to become Christians in West Africa were 300 Africans? They became Christians from their pure heart and innocent mind. They agreed to follow John Hawkins, and that was how he mischievously took them to America and enslaved them all. Inside the slave ship of Captain John Hawkins, inside that slave ship of Captain John Hawkins, they chained our African ancestors like dogs and cattle. They caged our mothers, sisters, and brothers and kept them with rodents and insects. Oh, I must tell you how bitter it was. They raped and sodomized our parents in their European slave ship. Africans were reduced to the lowest animals ever and subjected to brutal savagery and complete barbarism. Our African ancestors died and tyranny, brutality was unleashed on them in the slave ship. History recorded that over 10 million Africans were drowned to death by the European slave masters during the transatlantic slave trade. The European reptilian, vulturish and vampire eyes, their vampire eyes, they sucked the very lifeblood of our African people. African little black infant babies were snatched from their mothers and were sexually molested and visually raped in front of their helpless parents by European homosexuals and pedophiles during the mid-15th century. But your history lecturer in University of Calabar, in the Oxford University, will never tell you this. They will never tell you this truth. They will never tell you this untold history of the black man. African fathers, brothers, daughters, mothers, and uncles were sodomized into barbaric sexuality. African boys and girls were forced by the white men to have sexual intercourse so that the girl child will be pregnant and have slave children for the European slave master. This was a vicious humiliation of generations of African people under white supremacy for over 400 years. And you don't want us to speak about it. And TikTok will still ban the video. Social media don't want us to speak. They will still ban the video, but we are speaking the facts. We are speaking the truth. It's not by banning the video. The people need to be awake. The people will need to know that there was a time they were enslaved for over 400 years. Their mothers were sexually abused by the European slave masters. This is historically recorded, but they want to discard it. Our mothers and sisters were sexually abused every day in the slave ship by white sex addicts. And they inflicted our African ancestors with the most barbaric, sodomized and sexual violence. The religion of the European slave masters, which is Christianity, condole all this barbarism and evil. That was why the Christian missionaries could not speak when their fellow whites were taking Africans as slaves. Rather, they were busy using their Bible to brainwash Africans to be silent and blindly accept every treatment from the white man. Because they are told that they are black because the devil is black, therefore they are children of the devil. Because the African was told that the white man is white because God is white and is a child of God. So we are the children of the devil. Our people and ancestors were killed and our mothers were brutalized in the name of their white Jesus. According to Jomo Kenyatta of Kenya and Desmond Tutu of South Africa, when the white man said we should close our eyes to pray, after praying, we opened our eyes. We found Bible in our hands, precisely the King James Version, which was translated under King James in the year 1611 in England. Now, after our African ancestors finished praying, they opened their eyes. They found Bible in their hands. But their land was seized and they have been conquered by their white Jesus. They have been conquered by the European white Jesus. That is why the brain of the white man is the brain of the black man is that Jesus is white. Jesus is white. That's what is in his brain because they have acted movies to portray Jesus as white. We have to wake up from our slumber, black people. We have to wake up from our slumber. Our ancestors were caged and butchered like meat to be used for their partial science, for their pseudoscience. In the year 1517, a Catholic priest named Bartholomew de las Cascas advised the European kings. He advised the European kings, queen, and the church papacy headed by the Pope to use black Africans as slaves that are in Africa. This was how black people, this was how black Africans were transported to America as slaves to work in the American plantations and European plantations. This shows that the Christianity and the church endorsed slavery in Africa and the maltreatment of our black African ancestors. We Africans must know that our history is very political. When it comes to the history of a black man or of the black man, it becomes highly political. It becomes highly political. A people who do not know their history are programmed to go into extinction. Today, under the hypocrisy and pretense of white democracy, we have continued their they have continued their onslaught under the pretense of human rights. The demonization and the dehumanization of African people is still going on. Under the pretense of foreign aid in international political system and foreign investment, their companies and industries are exploiting our natural resources in Africa. We have to wake up from our slumber. We have to wake up and understand that there is a history in Africa we need to know. Under the mischief of constitutionalism and international diplomacy, they plundered, theft, and unleashed brutality and atrocities on our people. They spit on the memories of our African ancestors and forefathers by arrogantly rooting our cultures and tradition of our people out of us. They are taking our culture out of us. The education of the white slave masters is a system of misinformation and miseducation, which is an instrument used for mass indoctrination and brainwashing of Africans yesterday and today. Their English law established their repugnancy doctrines. If you're a student of law, you will understand what I mean by the repugnancy doctrine. This is the law that they use to remove all those moral systems in Africa. Those moral systems in Africa that they declared as barbaric and unnatural. Instead, they legalized a new law that encouraged injustice, corruption with their English judicial system or their European judicial system as a stronghold. Africans must read their history. Africans must wake up from their slumber. This is the history of the black man you must know. And this is how Christianity came to Africa. Through brutality. Through barbarism. Africans were enslaved. Our innocent African children were abused in the ship of slave trade. And you want us to accept this religion. And I see a black man shouting in the name of Jesus. There is no power in the name of Jesus. I tell you today, brothers and sisters. There is no power in the name of Jesus. If there is power in the name of Jesus, then the people in the hospital will not be in the hospital. There will be space in the hospital because you should be healed in the name of Jesus. Look at our pastors. They only have power in their church, but they don't have power in the hospital and in the mortuary. We have general overseers. They used to organize program every year. Some of them, they call it Glory Rain. Some of them, they call it different kind of names just to get the heart of the people in Africa. But yes, ask yourself, is there any changes about you? Is there any change? Do you have any change? Are you not the same? Is the problem not still there? But I know because you are indoctrinated, you will come out and tell us that the problem is not there. But the problem is there. You have to say the truth, speak the truth, say it the way it is. The general overseers, they are exploiting our mental consciousness. They are growing fat. They are rich. They have limousines. They have cars. They have different kind of expensive things of life that you will need. That you need as a human being. But you see, when the general overseer is done teaching and preaching on a Sunday, he will come out and enter his car and he will zoom off. You, the common member that is putting the tithes, you will now go and stand at a particular junction and start rushing bus with your fellow brothers and sisters. You have to wake up. You are being exploited. You are being used. It is because you lack the enthusiasm, you lack the desire, the zeal. You lack the zeal to study. That is why we only use our phone for pornography. We only use our phone for many things that will not improve our life. This is the time for us to what? Chase knowledge. This is the time for us to pursue knowledge. Chase knowledge. Because we are in the age of enlightenment. We are in the age of knowing. This is the age of the serpent. That is another topic I will talk about. The serpent is not evil. The serpent is the one that comes to open your eye. In Egyptian mythology, in the Sumerian mythology, the serpent is Enki. Enki was the one who made humans to know. He opened our eyes from Enli. Enli is the Yahweh in the Bible. Enli is the Yahweh in the Bible, the God of storms. He's the God of storms. The one you call Satan. The one you call Satan is Enki. The one that wants you to know, to be awake. But Enli had to manipulate the mind of humans. That is Yahweh. Therefore, the God in the Bible is not the true God. We have to know this truth.